There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. How are you today? Doing pretty good. Can I answer any questions for you before we get started today? Okay. Basically, the idea for today is there's a handful of real basic sort of stuff I wanted to get through. The first part of it, of course, is going to be all talking about what Rails is and what Rails isn't, that sort of thing. Then hopefully we'll have time to also talk about how to get Rails installed and set up and maybe get a little bit of practice in, be able to actually start creating our first little Rails application and start fiddling with it. We'll get through as much of that as we have time for today. We'll stop wherever we have to stop and pick up next time with wherever we leave off.
Rails is just on the web stuff, right? It's not
That's right.
applications.
Rails is very specifically a web product, or for creating web products. Rails is really meant for the creation of database-driven web applications. So in a way, you would compare Rails to something like PHP or any of those other languages that fall into that server-side scripting niche. So PHP, ASP, JSP, Cold Fusion, any of those kinds of things, and Rails all kind of live in the same space, right? They all are meant to basically do the same sort of thing. Let you write scripts that will execute on the server in response to a web request that's sent in. The response then itself will actually be typically HTML that gets sent back and is rendered by a browser, right? The way that Rails, though, is very different than a lot of those other ones that I mentioned is that Rails isn't just a server-side language. It is a server-side framework, right? So if you compare it to something like PHP, if you're starting a brand new website, web application off in PHP, what do you start with? Basically nothing, right? Until you write your very first PHP script, there's nothing there. The PHP language is installed. Right? The PHP engine is available to be used, but in a new PHP web application, you start off basically from absolute ground zero. You've got nothing, right? And you have to basically build every single part of that web application up yourself. Rails, on the other hand, being a framework, is kind of what it sounds like. It's a framework. So when you start a new Rails application, you don't start with nothing. Instead, Rails is sort of this collection, a fairly large and extensive collection of pre-written scripts and components that are all there to basically facilitate the creation of a new web application. So with something like PHP, you start off with nothing and you write it all yourself. With something like Rails, you start off with something. If I start a new Rails website, I don't have to do things like think, how am I going to access the database? Well, Rails already has built into the framework how you're going to access the database. That's already there. You just access it, right? You might think, how am I going to handle templates? How am I going to build page templates and insert data into them for displaying to the user? Well, with PHP or something like that, you would have to write all that code yourself. But with Rails, that's all already there, right? So it's like Rails is this platform that you can stand on. Right? And then from this fundamental set of scripts that they give you, you can build up from there. Essentially, the way it always felt to me was like all the busy work has been stripped out. If you write 20 different PHP-based websites, chances are 20 different times you're going to write virtually identical code. Right? Not every tiny little bit of it, of course, but a lot of it's going to end up being identical or very close to being identical between those 20 different projects. Right? If you take all that stuff that's sort of standard, that's sort of boilerplate, and you extract it out, that's kind of what Rails gives you. So if you start 20 different Rails websites, the actual code that you write for each one is probably going to be fairly unique to each one of those 20 different projects, because all of that mundane, you have to do it for every project type work, Rails takes care of all that junk for you. How do you do templates? How do you work with the database? How do you handle user requests? How do you deal with form submissions? All that stuff is all just basically taken care of. So it makes developing web applications in Rails feel much, much faster than it typically feels to me when I'm working in something like PHP, for example, right? So anyway, Rails is kind of a hot topic nowadays, right? A lot of people talk about it. It's sort of the new up-and-coming thing. What is it that everybody seems to think that makes Rails so special, right? Well, there's a handful of things. One of them is that Rails is a very real framework. It's not something that was developed academically or just because it seemed like a good idea. The way Rails actually came to be is there's a company called 37 Signals. They created a large web application, very popular, called Basecamp. When they created Basecamp, what they wanted to do was they wanted to be able to create it and similar type products in a very rapid, streamlined sort of manner. And what they actually ended up doing was creating Rails as sort of a byproduct of creating Basecamp. So they kind of built Basecamp, pulled out the parts of it that were going to be similar to all the other products that they wanted to create, and that part that they pulled out is what actually became Ruby on Rails. Right? Rails was actually, well, the creation of Rails is generally credited to a guy named David Hannemeyer Hansen. Right? DHH is what he always goes by. I lost what the D stood there for just a second. David Hannemeyer Hansen. It was first released around 1994, I believe it was. No, not 1994, 2004. Sorry, I remember there was a 4 in there. I just thought it feels like further away than it actually is. 2004, right? So compared to a lot of web type stuff, a lot of server-side language type stuff, Rails is still relatively new, right? And it does occasionally show its age, especially in the fact that it's still in very rapid development. It's still changing very, very quickly. From every 6 months, every year or so, there tends to be a new version of Rails that often has a lot of stuff in it that's quite different than the version that came before. Once you do start learning Rails, if you think that it's going to be something that you're going to use at all routinely, you got to really pay attention to it. You got to keep up with it. If you learn Rails now and then you sit back for a year and don't touch it, don't pay any attention to it, what you'd come back to a year later will probably throw you for a loop, because chances are it's going to have a lot of stuff in it that wasn't there when you first learned it. Right? So you got to kind of keep up with it. Right? But anyway, the fact that it's real is certainly one of the nice things about it. It's not an academic tool. It's a tool that was very specifically built to solve a very specific problem, and that's good. Right? Another one of the nice things about Rails is the idea of convention over configuration. Basically, there have been a lot of other web frameworks or web type languages that were created. Right? And what happened with a lot of them was they, of course, were trying to solve lots of different little problems. They wanted to solve the data access problem. They wanted to solve the templating problem. They wanted to solve the user interaction problem. And what a lot of these different frameworks would end up doing is they would end up having these extensive sets of configuration files where you could say, this particular template file goes along with this particular type of URL, which goes along with this particular table in the database. All of those tie-ins between all the different parts in the framework would have to be put into configuration files to make the whole thing work. JSP, I'm looking at you, right? It was the worst about that sort of thing, in my opinion, right? What Rails does is it takes kind of a different tact in that instead of making you configure everything out the wazoo, Rails just assumes a certain convention, assumes things are going to be done a particular way. Files are going to have particular names, database tables are going to have particular names, files are going to be kept in particular locations. And overall, what that ends up accomplishing is that as long as you follow the Rails convention, as long as you're naming things correctly, putting them in the right place, there ends up being almost no configuration that has to be done in order to get all the pieces of Rails to work together. It just assumes all of these conventions, and as long as you follow the conventions, then it will be correct and it will be able to find and tie together all the different parts of the framework without you having to ever tell it very specifically where all the different parts and pieces are. That can be a really nice thing. Right? An example of this is that Rails always expects the names of database tables to be pluralized. So if I was going to, for example, have a table in a database where I kept track of turtles, specific turtles that I was studying or tracking, the table in the database would be called turtles with an S on the end. It would be plural, right? In Rails, then, it expects for class names to always be singular. So if I wanted to have a name, a Ruby class that basically sort of stepped in and made it easier for me to work with that data in the database, what would be called a model, I would name that file turtle, no S, right? Rails would automatically then recognize that I have a turtle class, that there's a turtles table in the database, and it would automatically hook the two together. So without me having to build something into my class saying this is the database table that you're supposed to work with, Rails would figure that out on its own based simply on the names of the database table of the file of the class, right? I wouldn't have to do anything else. So learning Rails conventions is very, very important, right? Because as long as you stick to them, life will be fairly easy. But if you deviate from them, usually you can still get by, right? But life tends to get a little bit more difficult, right? When you kind of step off the Rails path, right? Something that people often complain about with Rails is because of this idea of convention over configuration, right? They had to make Rails basically a very opinionated piece of software, a very opinionated framework, right? What if you don't think that database tables should be pluralized, right? Well, Rails thinks they should be. That's an opinion, right? And you see that sort of thing in Rails all over the place, places where Rails just assumes that you're going to do things the Rails way. And if that way doesn't happen to be your way, then, you know, you can either get used to doing it Rails way, or you can spend all the time you work in Rails fighting with it, is really what it'll kind of end up coming down to, right? All right, Rails, another nice thing about it is that it tries to follow the 80-20 rule. This is sort of what I was mentioning to you before, where when you do a lot of projects sort of by hand in something like PHP, often there's a lot of kind of boilerplate code that you have to repeat over and over and over again. Well, that stuff is the 80%. What they kind of assume in Rails is that about 80% of the work that goes into a web application is going to be fairly identical between all different applications. So Rails tries to take care of that 80% of the work for you, which means that you can then just concentrate on the other 20%, the part that is truly and absolutely unique to that one particular web application you're working for. Right? Overall, that could have a couple of different effects. One of them is that you could end up producing things 80% faster. Right? That's usually about the way it goes. If you gave me a random web application and asked me to write it in Rails, asked me to write it in PHP, I could probably do it in Rails about 80% faster, because Rails does about that much of the work for me. It just wouldn't take that long. Right? On the other hand, the way it typically actually works out, right, is that I always feel like because Rails takes care of so much of the busy work for me, it actually allows me to be a little bit more advanced, a little bit more adventurous. You know, if somebody comes to me and says, will you build me a web application, build me a website that does X, Y, and Z. If I were going to write it in PHP, I would be very, very conservative in what I would promise to be able to put into the web application, because I know that in PHP, the majority of the time I'm going to have to spend is going to be on that boilerplate 80%, right? Whereas if I had the freedom to be able to write that web application in Rails, I would say, yeah, sure, I can do all that, and hey, I could probably also do this, and I could do this other thing. You know, given the same amount of time, you can go much, much further with a Rails application than you usually can with something written in PHP, because so much of your time is freed up. Right? So I overall think it ends up being a whole lot more fun, because you don't spend all your time just writing the boring stuff. You can actually go off and do some interesting things with the code that you're writing. Right? Does this make sense so far? Y'all have any questions yet? All right. Next one of the big benefits, and this is a little bit of a deeper one. One of the next benefits of Rails is that it follows what's called the Model View Controller design pattern. MVC, it's often called. M for model, V for view, C for controller. Right? Essentially what MVC, what this design pattern is a particular philosophy in how the code you write should be split up. Right? Unlike in a kind of fairly regular classroom type PHP application where a single file might have code in it that is displayed to the user, that deals with input from the user, that interacts with the database. In Rails, what happens is all of those different things get split up and put into very specific pieces, very specific classes or modules. Right? With MVC, essentially what we end up with is three fundamental parts. Right? We've got M, the model. The model is responsible pretty strictly just for interacting with data in the database. Whenever we want to put data into the database, we go through the model. Whenever we want to retrieve data from a database, we go through the model. Right? Whenever we want to do any kind of manipulation of the underlying data for the application, it's always the model that's going to do that for us. Right? The model also sometimes will involve some levels of business logic. So if there were validations of the data that needed to take place before the data was actually stored, the model would most likely do that. And sometimes the model will also handle some basic formatting of data that's retrieved from the database before it's actually used by the application itself. So the model is always sort of this underlying layer that kind of stands between us and the database, taking care of all those interactions. Right? The model layer in Rails is pretty neat because it does a tremendously good job of writing SQL for us. Most of the time in a Rails application, you don't have to write any SQL unless you actually want to. Right? Most of the time, the model layer, we simply tell it in sort of object-oriented terms what data we want and that sort of thing, and it automatically writes the SQL that's necessary to talk to the database for us. All right? So that's the M in MVC. The V is for view. Right? The view part of MVC has everything to do with what the user is going to see, what data is actually going to be returned back to the user. Typically here we're talking about HTML, but it doesn't necessarily strictly have to be HTML. There's no reason that we can't set the view part of a Rails application up so that it also has the option of returning data formatted as XML, for example, or as JSON data to be used by JavaScript, or any other format that we happen to come up with. Right? But essentially everything having to do with the actual data, the actual formatting of the data that will be returned to the user, that's all going to be something that's a part of the view portion of the MVC design. Right? The last part, C, controller, is what that stands for, should actually be the first part because it's where most interactions start. The controller section, the controller part of a Rails application is the part that's responsible for interpreting and responding to requests from the user. So whenever a request comes from the user, it's always the controller that first gets access to that request, and the controller then sort of becomes the glue that ties the models and the views together. Right? So if a request comes in from a user, a controller gets that request and based on the request can decide what data do we need to get from the model, or what data manipulation needs to take place over in the model part. Right? It then also decides what views do we need to be able to respond to the user. The controller gets those two different pieces, maybe data from the model, view from the view section, puts them all together, forms a response, and that's what then gets sent back to the user. Right? So model's very responsible for the data part, view's very responsible for the presentation part, and the controller basically ties those two different pieces together. Right? As a matter of fact, the way this all kind of tends to play out, yeah, I don't guess it can be, can it? That's what I'm looking for. Right? The way this all kind of typically plays out, right, is that we typically start off with a request coming in from the user. Say here, we've got an incoming request from the user. Stop it. There we go. The very first thing that we typically encounter when we get to Rails is actually another piece that isn't specifically MVC related, but is certainly an important part of Rails, and it's the Rails router. There we go. Okay. The Rails router actually takes any URL that happens to come in and sort of parses the URL apart, and based on that figures out which controller and which method of which controller, a controller basically just being a class, actually ends up needing to be called. Right? So the request comes in, it starts off by hitting the router. After that, the router then will pick a particular controller and hand the request off to it. There we go. The controller then, looking at the request, will decide what it is that it needs to actually do with it in terms of data. So basically the controller will go over and find an appropriate model which will interact with the database for us. Yeah. So let's see. The request goes from the router over to the controller. The request goes from the controller. Well, some kind of interaction is going to end up going from the controller over to the model. Yeah. Data will probably be retrieved and brought back over to the controller. The controller will also then go over and interact with whatever views may end up being necessary. Essentially, data will be pulled in from the model, views will be pulled in from the views. The controller will sort of synthesize those things all together. We'll put together a response which then gets sent back to the user again, is the way these different parts actually end up fitting together for the most part. Okay? So we'll spend a whole lot of time talking about routes, talking about controllers, talking about models, talking about views. When we put together our first little sample app with Rails here, you'll find that there are very specific places where all of those different things live. So it's put together in a pretty nice, neat little way. Make sense? Okay. All right. Another one of the nice things about Rails, another one of the nice things about this MVC stuff, is that Rails, excuse me, very much encourages us to keep our code dry, DRY, don't repeat yourself. Right? By having all the different parts of an application split up into model, view, controller, along with a few other little pieces that get thrown in, right? It helps us create code that is usually pretty small, pretty tight, pretty focused, and where there's not a lot of room for us to end up having to repeat the same code in multiple places. Right? You can still do it if you try really hard, but for the most part, Rails does a pretty good job of helping us keep our applications nice and dry, nice and tidy. Okay? Another one of the benefits of Rails is that when you work in Rails, about the only language you're primarily going to have to be concerned with is Ruby. Right? If you write an application in another server-side language, PHP again, right? You of course would be working in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, SQL. You would have all of those languages slapping you in the face all the time. Right? In Rails, you certainly still can write in all of those languages if you want, and we do still tend to use HTML and CSS to a fair extent. But for the most part, most of the things you need to do in a Rails application can be done simply in Ruby. Right? There's a lot of Ruby helpers, a lot of different methods and things that are put together for us that make it easier for us to do things like write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Pretty much everything in the controllers and the models is written exclusively in Ruby. Right? So Ruby kind of becomes the overall language that we spend most of our time working in. We have to worry far, far less about a lot of those other development languages than worrying about just Ruby itself. Okay? You remember back at the beginning of our Ruby class, I mentioned to you that one of the reasons that Ruby was originally developed was to promote developer happiness. Right? Matz, when he created it, wanted to create a language that developers would feel good about working in, would enjoy, would find joy in. Right? Rails kind of also carries forward that idea. Right? In Rails, they feel that there should be an emphasis on beauty in the code. Right? It's listed as another one of the benefits of the language. Well, what in the world do I mean by an emphasis on beauty? Well, occasionally in Rails programs you run into some pretty neat looking little segments of code that can be kind of fascinating to think about. For example, instead of turtles, let's say that I'm building a web application to keep track of data about octopus sightings. Right? In my octopus sightings, I want people to list the time and place, the location of where an octopus was seen, and I want them to be able to give an individual description of each one of the octopus's arms. Right? In order to actually store this data in the database, I decide that I'm going to need an octopus table, right, to keep track of the general octopus information, time and location where it was sighted, things like that. But I'm going to need a separate table. I'm going to want a separate table to keep track of each one of the octopus's individual arms. So I'm going to have two different tables in my database that are going to be related to one another. So every octopus, of course, is going to need an ID number, and that ID number is going to have to be used as a foreign key in the arms table so we know which arms belong to which octopus, right? If we were doing that by hand, it certainly wouldn't be the worst SQL that we would have ever probably run across, right? But it's mildly complicated. It's not something you probably do in your sleep. You'll have to stop and pay it a little bit of thought and make sure you're careful about how you actually implement it. Well, if we were going to do that idea, implement that idea of an octopus table related to an arms table in Rails, how would we do it? it would end up looking something like class octopus, right? Which would be a model, which means that it would inherit from active record base. We would start off just like that, and simply based on the fact that I had named my class octopus, right, Rails would automatically know to look for an octopus table in the database. Octopus is kind of a tricky word though, isn't it? It doesn't pluralize normally. Well, Rails is actually pretty smart. Active record here, the model layer, is actually pretty smart about pluralizations. Even in a lot of cases where you have non-standard type pluralizations, active record is able to handle it. And if it isn't, it does have a quick, easy little mechanism that you can use to step in and tell it how to correctly pluralize a strange word. Right? So I told you before, if I wanted to study turtles, right, my class here would be called turtle, and it would automatically look for a turtles database table. Right? But if I created a model here called person, right, it would automatically look in the database for a table called people. It knows how to correctly pluralize person. I don't actually know if it would automatically pluralize octopus to octopi, but if it didn't, I know exactly where I could go to tell it that that is how to pluralize octopus, and it would be a little couple words that I would have to type in order to make it work. Okay? But anyway, right, just based on what I've typed there, it would automatically know to look for something like an octopus or an octopi table in the database. If I then wanted to cause there to be a relationship between the octopus table and the arms table, right, all I would have to do is say has many arms, and that would be it. All the work that you would normally have to do with copying ID numbers from one table to another, right, writing join statements to join together records from the two different tables, Rails does all that automatically for you under the hood, right? Just based on what I have there, these 3 tiny little lines of code, right? I could have 2 different related tables, and Rails would understand how the data between the 2 of them is related to one another and could automatically synthesize those into objects for me. Right? So I wouldn't have to write any SQL. This would be about all I would have to do. Right? I could create an octopus object from this class. Right? I could assign it as many different ARM objects as I wanted. I could tell it to save it, and it would automatically populate the database for me. Right? Or I could go to the octopus class, and I could say find the octopus that was seen at this time at this location, and it would automatically retrieve it and populate an object with all of its data, including all of the sub-ARM objects that would be a part of it. Right? It's like magic a lot of times. So it's that sort of thing that you see in Rails that make it seem so fascinating. Is my video still running? It did not stop. Cannot have stopped. Nope. Okay. It says it's still running. The icon up at the top just seemed to disappear for a little bit. I was going to lose it if that happened. I think it's okay.
Is there a preset over that said World of Warcraft on it?
There was. Do you know what that would be for? Why would you record a video for World of Warcraft? Or of World of Warcraft? Do you record your games when you play it? I've never played it before.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot. I don't play it, but I'm positive there's lots
People
of people
record
that
it for when they go, like when they get through something, they go back and do it again. They'll watch what they did and see how everything worked out.
Oh, is that what it is?
tutorials and stuff. People
That makes sense.
places.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that, but yeah, my software here does have a World of Warcraft setting specifically for recording that, I guess. Interesting. All right, anyway, emphasis on beauty. Just like Ruby itself, Rails is also big on testing. So testing is something that is fully supported and is strongly encouraged by Rails. We'll see a lot of testing related stuff. Rails comes with some great development tools built into it. For example, a web server, right, built into every Rails project individually. So whenever we start on a new Rails web application, instead of having to install and configure a separate web server, we just don't even have to worry about it. Whenever we create a new Rails application, there is a Ruby-based web server built right in that we can start up immediately and start working with. Right? Every Rails application also has a built-in console, basically a little command line application that we can use to interact with our web application on the command line. So if putting together the views or something in the application is giving us a bit of a fit and we're having trouble kind of working our way through it, we can actually go out to sort of a command line based version of our application as a support tool, something that lets us kind of get behind the scenes, get under the hood, and be able to see what's going on with the different classes and methods and the data and all of that fun sort of stuff. So very good. Right? Rails also comes with some nice generators. Generators are basically little scripts that automatically write code for you. So if I wanted to, for example, create a new model, kind of like I did over here, instead of having to type every bit of it up by hand like I just did, there's actually a generator in Rails. I could have said, make this model for me. Make for me a model called Octopus that has many arms. And it would have been able to write all that code for me without me having to type anything other than a command on the command line to run the generator. Right? So some great development tools built in. Right? Just like in Ruby, Rails has lots of gems. Right? We talked about gems back in the Ruby class. There are lots of Rails-related gems that we can use to enhance and modify what our Rails applications are capable of. Rails also offers us support for different environments. Essentially, every Rails application can be run in 3 different modes. We can run it in a development mode, we can run it in a test mode, and we can run it in a production mode. Right? The difference between the 3, right, is probably what you would guess. In development mode, classes are reloaded automatically, so we don't have to shut down and restart the application every time we make a change. That's less efficient. Right? But in development mode, we're not typically as worried about efficiency. Right? In development mode, anytime something goes wrong, we also get big, long, verbose errors given to us that we can use to help diagnose what the problem might be. Okay? In testing mode, generally very few errors are shown. Right? Canned preset data is always used, so we can basically run through series of tests, right? Test-based development, on our application without actually interacting with it in any particular way. And in production mode, right, errors are generally not shown, not in any specific way. Right? Classes are always cached, so the application has to be restarted if changes are made, but that makes it faster and more efficient. Right? So Rails applications can always be set to run in any of those 3 modes depending on, of course, what you're doing with it. If you're in development, run it in development mode. If you're putting it out on the web live, you go over to production mode. If you're just running a batch of tests, test mode happens automatically. It's a wonderful convenience, right? Especially since you can do things like use separate databases for each one. Right? Since Rails makes a fairly clean separation between the 3 modes, it tends to make life a lot easier. In development, for example, I could tell it to just use a quick little easy SQLite database. Right? Whereas when it goes to production mode, it would maybe know to automatically look for Postgres or MySQL, right? A larger, more production-ready type database. So some good stuff there. Right? Overall, lots and lots of good stuff. I could go on. You want me to? That's probably enough. That's probably enough for the list of good things, nice things about Rails, some of its benefits. Okay. So is Rails an absolute perfect thing? Of course not. Right? There are complaints against Rails. There are things that occasionally can make Rails less than ideal. Right? I don't want to sell it too strong and have you go out of here thinking that writing a web application in anything but Rails is silly. Right? That's not true. Right? Rails is a tool, another tool to put into your tool belt. There are times when it's the right tools and there's the right tool, and there are certainly times also when it's not the right tool. Right? Some of the things that might make you steer away from Rails in certain circumstances. Right? It is often not as performant as some other server-side scripting languages. If PHP and Rails were in a foot race with one another, PHP would win pretty much every time. Rails applications can be made to be very fast, certainly, right? But typically, because you're sort of starting from a slightly slower point, it takes a lot more work, a lot more know-how in order to get a Rails application to get super fast, right? Whereas it takes a lot less work to get something like a PHP application to be super fast. Right? So that's something that can be said against it. Right? The fact that it's fairly new also sometimes contributes to some problems with Rails. Right? One of my biggest headaches ever with Rails is deployment. When I'm ready to take it from development on my own local development system and I actually want to stick it out on an actual server for the world to be able to access, it's gotten a whole lot easier in the last 5 or so years, but still, in most situations, it can be really, really tricky to deploy. Right? The deployment story with Rails is really something that I hope that they address, hopefully in the next coming handful of years. Like I said, it has gotten a whole lot better, but it still has a long way to go. Right? Something like PHP, it's pretty simple. Write your PHP script, upload it to the server, stick it in the right directory, and bam, that's it. Right? Nothing to it. Rails, on the other hand, not often like that. Take your Rails application, upload it, maybe have to do a little bit of configuration on the server, create a special link to this one directory, make sure the permissions are all set right here, set right there. It can be much, much more tricky. Okay? There are some nice services nowadays, like there's a platform as a service company called Heroku that's gotten pretty popular. And certainly one of the best things about Heroku is that it is by far the easiest Rails deployment system I've ever seen. Very, very simple to do. Right? It has its own drawbacks, though. Heroku does. But one way or another, that is another one of the tricks that you sometimes face when you're working with Rails. Getting it out into production can be a bit of a pain. Right? I already mentioned to you that's a little bit trying sometimes because Rails is changing so quickly. Right? You might list that as another mark in the negative column. It would really kind of be nice in a way if Rails would just slow down and let us get some work done for a while, instead of every couple months having to go back and re-update all your old Rails applications because a brand new wonderful version is out. Part of me wishes for that. Right? But on the other hand, part of me is always amazed at the new and wonderful ideas that they keep building into all the new versions, and I'm glad they continue to move forward as quickly as they are. So, I'm not sure whether to count how quickly Rails is changing as a positive or a negative. Right? One way or another, it's there, and it's something that has to be dealt with.
What are some sites that are about Rails?
Sites that are doing Rails? Oh, there's a bunch of them. What's the biggest one? Twitter is certainly one of the biggest and most well-known sites that use Rails. Talking about the performance issues, right? That's something that they very much faced and had to deal with. 20 best sites built with Ruby on Rails. Just curious what I would get if I went out and looked for this. Hopefully it won't be porn. What was that? Oh yeah, Basecamp. Most definitely. Basecamp, Scribed, Hulu, Crunchbase, SlideShare, Funny or Die, Zendesk, GitHub, Yellow Pages, MedHelp, OneHub. I haven't even heard of half of these. Freckle, Chowhound. There's Twitter in the early days. 43 things. Yeah. Goes on and on. There is no lack of big websites that are running Rails. It's not a tiny little hobbyist thing. There are lots of really big tier 1 grade A, very, very popular, very, very highly visited websites that are using Rails. It can certainly be used for that. Curious what else. Same list? No, slightly different list. Shopify. Yeah, I like Shopify. Backpack, Lighthouse. I could sit and look through these all day. Ooh, Urban Dictionary. That's awesome. Yeah. I can now directly say that Rails has helped me learn how to curse more creatively. That's awesome. Okay. One last thing that you might put in the negative column with Rails, and this is really sort of a weird one, but it's something that I've seen over and over again, is that in a Rails application, you would be surprised how easy it is to be able to create something without actually even understanding what you're doing. Right? I don't know if you could count that as a negative aspect of Rails or if that's just a negative aspect of human nature. We're often more interested in getting the job done than we are actually understanding what we did in order to get the job done. But that's something that happens. Rails automates and does so much work for us that it's not difficult to create something that seems fairly complex and actually have no idea whatsoever how it works. Okay? So that's something to be a little bit cautious of, because of course that is fine as long as the thing keeps working. But the day that it stops working and you don't understand how it worked in the first place, that's when you typically find yourself in trouble. Right? So one way or another, something to keep in mind. Okay? How are we on time? What time do we start? 11? So we go to 12:20? Good. Okay. Let's dig in then.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Running a server on my computer
Uh-huh.
and using Ruby and PHP, problems.
Nope. Not generally. How's your PHP setup? Are you using full Apache with PHP module? All right, so that's going to be running on port 80. Most of the time when we run our little local Rails development server, we'll run it on something like port 3000. So there won't be a conflict between the two. You can have them both going at the same time and won't be any issue.
Okay.
Okay?
Like security-wise, should I be running on something different than port 80?
I don't think so. I can't think off the top of my head of any particular problem with running it on port 80. On your computer, port 80 may be blocked from external access, or it may not. If it is blocked externally, then it's certainly no problem. Nobody can get to it but you locally. If it is open, then that would mean that other people would be able to come and surf your little websites that you have on your computer. Whether that's a problem or not kind of depends on what they are, I guess. Okay? All right. Let's start a little Rails application and kind of take a quick tour of what it looks like. Right? Like I had said before, when you start off something like a PHP application, you start with nothing and you build it all by hand. But when you start off with a Rails application, you already start off with a tremendous amount of material. So let's go ahead and create, right, a new little application. Oh, wait, we can't do that yet. I haven't even told you how to install Rails. Do you all already know?
Mine's already installed. I just updated Rails.
Okay, there you go. Oh, all right, we're all set. Just for the benefit of somebody who might be watching the video, let me just mention quickly, if you are installing Rails on Windows, go to railsinstaller.org. Right? Download it, follow the instructions, bam, you're done. That ought to pretty much be it. Okay? If you're installing Rails on a Mac, you're probably almost halfway there because Macs typically come with Ruby already installed. The only problem with the Ruby that comes installed on a Mac is that it's often fairly out of date. It would be nice to have a newer, more up-to-date version of Ruby. Yeah, 1.9.3 is what we would want to be using right now. Okay. What I have is, if you go out to my website, go to the Rails class, I have a little tutorial over here, how to install Ruby in OS X, which will take you through the steps of getting a newer, more modern version of Ruby installed. Okay? And then I have how to install, well, actually, that's about it. Once you get Ruby installed, a new, modern, updated version of Ruby installed on your Mac, then all you have to do is gem install Rails. Right? Gem space install space Rails, and you'll have Rails set up and ready to go.
Yeah, I can install it because it doesn't support.
Yeah, 187 is a bit out of date.
So how would I update it?
Yep, the instructions are there on my website.
I looked at that and I have to download Xcode. When I go to the App Store, it doesn't have the older version that goes with 10.6.
Oh, you've got an older operating system too. Huh. You wouldn't be able to get it from the App Store. I think you would need to probably go out to the Apple developer site, developer.apple.com, crawl through there and see if you can't track down an older version of Xcode that might work. If you can't find that, then the only thing I know to do is start Googling. Surely somebody has faced that and figured it out.
Is it very different, or is it very difficult to install Ruby and Rails on Linux?
No, It's usually, depending on your Linux version, just a matter of using the package manager to install a new version of Ruby. Once Ruby is installed, Ruby Gems is probably installed. Then you just gem install Rails, and it will download everything else you need. All right. All right, so assuming at that point that we have Ruby and Rails installed and set up, right, to actually create a new Rails application, there we go. Right. You just need to drop out to a command line. Right? Linux, Mac, or Windows, it doesn't matter. Drop out to a command line. Right? You're going to want to change directories to wherever it is that you want to create your new application. A lot of times when I'm doing development, I'll just make the application created on my desktop. Right? And then the Rails command should be available. If I type Rails-V, actually, let me try Rails-version. Rails is not currently installed? Yes, it is. Oh, I know why. I have RVM installed on my computer. Basically, RVM is not something you'd have to worry about on Windows. On Mac, what RVM does is it actually lets you have multiple versions of Ruby installed at the same time. If I type RVM list, for example, you can see I have Ruby 187 and Ruby 193 both installed. Okay. You can switch back and forth between the different versions using RVM. So if you still have websites that are back on 187 that you need to support, you can have that installed, and the newest one for writing new websites, new web applications, and stuff like that. Okay. You can also, through RVM, create what are called gem sets. Gem sets are sort of isolated little environments that you can install gems into. The idea being that you don't want to have gems from one project conflict with gems from another project. Right? So what I could do is I could say RVM, what is it? RVM, oh, gem set create. And maybe I'll create one called Rails class. There we go. I created a new gem set called Rails class. If I type RVM gem set list, it tells me these are the gem sets I currently have. I have one called flashcards, one called global, one called Rails class. I'll say RVM gem set use Rails class. Okay. Again, if I say RVM gem set list, it has a little arrow there showing me that Rails class is my current gem set. And then here, if I say gem install Rails, okay, it will install everything, all the gems I need in order for Rails to work into this particular gem set. So any gems I install, anything I do in class won't interfere with anything I do on any other projects, basically. I forgot that I needed to do this. And like I said, on Windows, there is no RVM, so you won't have to mess with this at all. On Mac, RVM is a great convenience. Gem sets are a great convenience. So, nice to have. Are we going to work here? TCC's network. I don't want to wait for it. I'm going to Control-C to kill it. I'll say RVM gem set use flashcards. That's another gem set that I already have that already is set up for 193, and I believe the most up-to-date version of Rails. Right? So if I say gem list, yeah, sure enough, all the gems are there that I need for Rails. I'll just need to remember to build that Rails class gem set next time I'm someplace that has actual real-life internet access, also known as not here at work. Right? Okay, once I'm there, if I type Rails -- version, there we go. It should come back and tell you what version of Rails you're using. Can't remember on Windows, it might just be regular -v. I don't remember if both of those work on Windows or if only one of them does. But it's a nice little reassuring thing to be able to do and see that yes, indeed, Rails is there, it's responding, and what version you've got. Okay? If you want to create a new Rails application, then what you do is you simply type Rails new, and then you tell it what you want your new application to be. I'm going to call it Tour App, because basically I'm just creating it so that we have something to sort of look at. Right? Take a little tour of all the different files and such that exist in a new Rails application. Right? When I hit enter here, watch the action. See all this stuff? That's all the files that were built for me, that were written for me automatically, right, in order to create this new application. So like I was saying, a brand new Rails application, you don't start with nothing. You start with a lot of stuff already being there, already being available. Right? Rails also comes with a nice tool called Bundler. Right? Bundler has to do with keeping your gems up to date. You might remember from Ruby class we talked about the fact that gems can have dependencies. One gem might require another gem, which might require another gem. That can get a little bit complicated when you start getting a lot of gems involved, and there are a lot of gems involved in most Rails applications. Bundler is just a nice little tool that makes it easier to be able to install, be able to update, be able to manage all of the different gems that are a part of your project. Right? I'll show you a little bit of that here in just one second. But that's it. I've got my new Rails app created. Right? I'm going to go ahead and pull it up in my editor. Why don't you want to move? All right. Oh, hang on a second. I'm going to change directories over to my app. Then I'll pull it up in my editor. There we go. All right, so over on the left, this is my brand new Rails app and everything that's in it and is a part of it. Okay? There are quite a few different folders, quite a few different files that are created for us automatically. Okay? Every Rails application is basically going to start off with this same structure, this same set of files, which right off the bat is a really nice thing. Okay? Have you ever written a web application and maybe you take all your images and you put it into a folder called images? You write a different web application and you put all your images into a folder called pictures. Maybe in one application your style sheets go into a folder called style sheets. Another one it goes into a folder called styles. Every different application you go to might be a little bit different, which makes it a little bit harder whenever you're switching between applications to figure out where did I put this or where did I put that. Well, every Rails application starts off with the same set of folders, generally with very specific places where all the different parts and pieces go. So if you create a Rails application, leave it for 6 months and come back to it, there's not going to be any question about where did I put this, where did I put that. Everything has a specific place and everything should be just there. Right? If you get a hold of somebody else's Rails application, maybe you inherit an application somebody else started, or an application that you created gets handed off to somebody else, there's an immediate familiarity with every Rails application because you always know right where everything goes. Okay? So what do we actually have in here? Well, just starting at the top. Very first folder we run into up at the top of the tree is a folder called App. This is basically the application itself. Most all of the code that you write that will make up your Rails application will all be in this app folder. Will almost all be in this app folder. Right? The app folder itself is just a container folder. There's no loose files in it anywhere. Okay? And what do we actually have under it? Well, there's a subfolder under app called Assets. And under Assets there's a folder for images, a folder for JavaScripts, a folder for style sheets. You want to take a wild guess what those are used for? Every image your application need goes into images, JavaScript files go into JavaScripts, style sheets go into style sheets. That's always where they're going to be, so you always know just where to find them. Right? I think these are mostly empty to start off with. Oh, we've got a little default Rails image. We've got a little default kind of starting JavaScript application, a little default style sheet that's already there. Right? So Assets is the first thing we have listed under App. Next thing we have under App is we have controllers. I was mentioning to you before MVC, the Model View Controller design. Well, this is where all the controllers go. Okay? There's also, you'll notice, a models folder, which is where all the models will go, and a views folder, which is where all the views will end up going. Right? So everything having to do with MVC, all of our models, all our views, all our controllers are all going to be in their own individual folders here under the apps folder. Right? The only other things we have here under apps then is there's a folder specifically for helpers. Helpers are little shared bits of code that can be shared between different views. They basically give us a way to help keep our code dry, where we can extract little common functions in a way out of multiple views and store them as helpers instead, to make them easier to maintain, easier to be able to find them, upgrade them, update them. Right? We also have a subfolder under here called mailers, which is a special folder where we put a particular type of controller, in a way, that handles sending and receiving emails. Okay? So the app folder is certainly kind of the heart of every Rails application. It's where we will spend 99% of our time. Right? That's the most important thing. Learn your way around in there. Right? Know to always look in the controllers folder for controllers, models for models, because that's where those things will always be. Easy enough? Okay. What else do we have? Next big top level folder we have after that is the config folder. Right? The config folder is where the little bit of configuration that you do have in a Rails application actually lives. These are mostly configuration files under here. Right? One of them that we have in here is called routes.rb. Right? The routes.rb file is how we interact with Rails router. Remember before when we were talking about the life cycle of a request in a Rails app, I mentioned that typically an incoming request first goes through the router. Right? Well, the routes file lets us configure the router, tell it different URLs that we want it to respond to, or specify how we want it to respond to different URLs. It looks like a kind of long file, right? But you'll notice that everything inside the basic class, the basic setup here, is a comment. It's just full of documentation. Right? The file actually itself only has 2 lines in it, this first one and the end at the bottom. Right? So like I said before, not a lot of configuration going on there, not yet. We'll be able to come back and put in what we need. Okay. What else do we have in here? We have a YAML file called database.yml. Okay. This YAML file, this database.yml file, is where we put in the configuration for our database. Okay. You can see that it specifies 3 different environments: development, test, and production. I had mentioned to you before that you could have a different database set up for each one of the different modes that a Rails app can work in. Well, this is where you put in the details for that. By default, all 3 modes here are set up to use SQLite, which basically means no configuration is necessary. If I started using this Rails app, the database would just work immediately without me having to do anything special in this file. But if when I was going to deploy this app, if I wanted it to say use MySQL database in production, then what I could do is down here in this production section, I could come in and put in my MySQL username and password, other configuration options for the database server. Okay. We also then in here have a file called environment.rb. Okay. Not a lot of configuration there. Right? Actually a file that you don't even typically have to touch all that much. What actually happens, right, is that this file, the application file, the boot file, all sort of defer to some of the files in these subfolders, right? Environments, initializers, and locales. Okay. Under environments, what we have is little independent configuration files for each one of our different environments. So if I wanted to configure how things work in development, I could do that here. Usually, there's nothing you need to actually do there. Right? Same basic thing for the production and test environments. Okay. Under initializers, what I can do is if I have anything that I want to run immediately when a new app is spun up, whenever the new app is started, I can put that there under initializers. Right? So, an example is there's a file in here called inflections. Remember I was mentioning to you before that Rails is pretty intelligent about figuring out how to correctly pluralize things. Right? A model called person would automatically translate into a database table called people. Right? Well, this inflections file lets me configure that. Right? So they've got some little examples in here talking about how to pluralize oxen. Ox to oxen and oxen to ox, for example. Person to people. Right? It lets us list in here things that can't be pluralized, like fish and sheep. Okay? So this little inflections file, being in the Initializers folder, will automatically be executed, will be loaded every time we start our app. That's what these initializers all tend to be about. They're initializers. Right? They're setup code. Okay? All right. The locales folder, right, makes it a lot easier for you to be able to translate your web application. Right? If you wanted to create your web application and have it not only work in English but work in other languages as well, what you could do is under the locales folder here, you could create a little YAML file for each language that you wanted to be able to support. The only one that's in here by default is EN for English. Okay. What we could do with these locale files is we could go in and do like what they have here, the little sample, for English, right? Whenever I ask for the value of hello, give back hello world. Right? I could then, for example, also have a Spanish locale. Right? And in the Spanish locale, I could say whenever we ask for hello, give us back hola, something like that. That is hello in Spanish, right? I was pretty sure it was, but thought I'd check just in case. Okay. So like I had said before, there's not a lot of configuration that you need to do with a Rails application. Any configuration you do need to do or that you are going to be able to do is pretty much all going to be here under this config folder. Right? The routes file, we interact with that one a fair amount. The routes file is one that we will be in and out of fairly regularly. The rest of these, very, very infrequently do we ever have to actually do anything configuring any of these other aspects. Once in a while, but not very often at all. Right? That's what we've got under config. Next top level folder we have is a folder called DB, right? Basically the database folder. What will happen under the database folder is a couple of things. One is that if we're using a local file-based database like SQLite, the database files themselves will be stored here in this folder. Right? There's already a file in there called seeds, which gives us a convenient place to be able to put in initialization data for our database. Data that we want to have loaded up automatically in the database whenever we put it on a new server, for example. We can also, under this DB folder, we will also, under this DB folder, end up having what are called migrations stored. Migrations are basically step-by-step instructions that Rails can follow that tell it how to create our database. If you think about how your database typically goes when you're making a web application, maybe you start off by creating a single table, right? And then later you come back and you add another table. And then maybe later you come back and you go to the first table and you change the name of a column. And then maybe later you add a third table. Usually when you're developing a web application, you don't start off from the very beginning with every table set up exactly the way that you're going to want it in the end product. It's often sort of an iterative process. That's well and good as long as you're working on your own, right? On a single computer, never moving, never sharing with anybody else. But what would happen if you did want to send a copy of your application to somebody else? How would you tell them to set up their database so that they could try out your application that you're sending them? Or if you had to switch from one computer to another, or you wanted to try out a different database server than what you started off with, it could be difficult to get the database back into the proper form for the application to be able to work with it. Right? That's what those things I mentioned called migrations are all about. They're sort of a step-by-step replay of everything you did to get the database to the way it is. So if I were to take this application that had this database gradually built up for it and I was to send it to somebody else, all they would have to do is tell Rails to rerun the migrations. Rails would just go through step by step everything I had done to the database until it was done, and then they would have the exact same database setup that I have. Right? Or if I had to switch to a different machine, or I switched to a different database server, just rerun the migrations. Right? Or if I made a mistake, right? If I added a new table to my database and I decide I didn't want it, I could just say roll back the migration. It could just undo database changes, which is something most databases don't do on their own. Right? But we can make it happen here. So that's the database folder. There's a doc folder, which is where documentation goes. There's a lib folder, which to a large extent is a bit of a catch-all. Every once in a while, you might run into a situation where a class needs to be created that's not specifically a model, a controller, a view, right? It's just sort of a random Ruby class that you wrote for one reason or another. Those sometimes will go out here in this lib folder. Okay. The lib folder also has some static assets that are always used, like jQuery for JavaScript, for example. Right? And it has a tasks folder, which lets us create what are called rake tasks. Right? Rake is a little command line utility, and we can write rake tasks to do little chores for us. So, say for example, in testing our application, we ended up uploading 1,000 pictures to it. Right? Well, we could make a little rake task that said clear uploaded pictures. And then whenever we wanted to, we could drop out to the command line, tell it to run that rake task, and it would clean up for us. Right? Other example of rake tasks, things that you want to have done offline, like every night at midnight, my website that I use for class goes out and pulls in the current number of enrolled students in all my classes for me and sticks it in a database. So I can then make little graphs of it and see how enrollment changes over time. I just have a little rake task that goes out and talks to Ted and pulls in that data for me. I wish it was actually as easy as I just made it sound. Right? Anyway, that's lib. Okay? Under log is where the logs are stored. Right? Server logs, database logs, all that sort of stuff is under log. Right? The public folder is just that. Right? The public folder is the only folder in a Rails application that is publicly accessible. If there's anything that you want to have accessible to everybody just automatically by typing in a URL, that material goes into the public folder. You'll notice that there's a file in here called index.html. Until we create our own initial home page or route for our Rails application, it's that index.html page that will act as the home page for our application. They also have some HTML pages in here for your standard error types. 404 for page not found, 500 for internal server error, 422, which is change not allowed, if I recall correctly, plus a robots.txt file, a little default fave icon, which I believe is just empty. I think it's just transparent. But it's a nice little reminder that you should make a fave icon for your application and put it out there to replace the default one. Okay? Under the script folder, we've got one script there, Rails. Right? It's basically the generator, right? The kind of do-everything little script that's built into the web application. Whenever we want to automatically generate new code, we do that. We run that Rails script. Whenever we want to run our web server, there it is. We run that with a particular command. We want to get into the console. It all happens through that one little script. Under the test folder is where all of our test files are stored. Right? So all the testing material that we put together is all stored here under the test folder. Okay? The temp folder, of course, is just that, temporary information. When the server needs to cache something, store other little temporary files, they all go there. Okay? And then finally the vendor folder. The vendor folder is basically where you find third-party code. Code that is not our code that we wrote. Code that is not strictly a part of Rails itself, right? But code that has been brought in from the outside to somehow enhance your application. A lot of times gems you install and things of that nature end up being stored here under the vendor folder, right? Along with third-party JavaScript, third-party style sheets. Nothing in there right now. So that's kind of the folders that we're dealing with. Okay. Some of the other files that are listed there just on the top level, right? You've got an automatic gitignore file. So if you're submitting your Rails application to GitHub or to some other Git-based version control system, it will automatically know which files should not be uploaded. Right? There's a thing built into Rails called rack. Config.ru is the configuration file for rack. Right? Rake file is part of that rake system I mentioned to you before. README is obviously a little documentation file. Right? And the one other thing we have in here that's crucially important is gem file. I mentioned to you before that Rails uses a tool called Bundler to keep track of gems and gem requirements. Right? All of that actually happens here through this gem file. Every gem that your Rails application needs to use is listed in the gem file. So you can see in here by default it's saying my application needs to use the Rails gem, version 3.2.11. Right? It needs the SQLite 3 gem. Right? The gem file also lets us split our gems up into different groups. Like there's specifically an asset group where there's a couple of gems, Sass and CoffeeScript and Uglifier. Sounds like a fun gem, doesn't it? Right? jQuery gem. Right? We can also split up our gems based on mode. So we could, for example, say these gems I only need in testing mode. These gems I only need in development. These other gems only in production. Bundler then automatically reads this file and can intelligently decide which gems to load, which gems to activate, which gems to make available. Right? The other file that goes along with this is called gemfile.lock. Right? The gem file itself, the one I have open now, is the one that we edit. Whenever we run Bundler, it then codifies all this, makes it more specific, and puts that into gemfile.lock, which the application itself then uses to figure out what gem, what version, where is it, all that fun stuff. Overwhelming? It's a lot of stuff, isn't it? Yeah. We'll be working our way through it. As it is, let's go ahead and start up the little server that comes with our application, just so we can see how to access our application through the browser, and then that'll probably be a good spot for us to stop today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back over to the command line. Okay. I've already changed directories to the folder where I created my application. If I want to start up my web server, all I have to do is type Rails space S. Okay. That's short for Rails space server. Okay. But just S is enough. If I hit enter, it will start up the Rails server. Whoa! I'm not supposed to get a big error. Oh, address already in use. I already have a Rails server running on port 3000. Okay? What I can do is I can tell it -p and give it a different port. So I'll say run this server on port 3001. You only need to do this if you're running more than one Rails server at a time, so they don't conflict. There we go. So it started cleanly on port 3001. Okay. Over in my browser then, if I go to localhost : 3001, the port where my application is running, that's the little index.html file that's in the public folder. Right? You can go check it out, look at the HTML code, and you'll see this is it. Right? So our web server is running, it's processing requests, responding as it should. That's all it took. If you think about what we've done so far in order to get this up and running, we basically typed two commands. We typed Rails new tour app, and we typed Rails S. Right? With those two commands, we got a full-fledged framework for a new web application put in place for us, and a web server that's ready to pop up, start running, and letting us develop, letting us test, letting us work. Okay? I know it doesn't do much yet. just seeing the static index file is not exactly the most exciting thing. But that's where we'll start off on Tuesday. Right? Tuesday we'll go in and we'll start playing with controllers, models, and views a little bit, just so we can get kind of an idea of how those different parts fit together. Right? After we do that, we'll probably back off from that and concentrate on some of those parts one at a time, models especially. We can spend some time just talking about models and not worrying about the rest. But before we do that, we will spend a little bit of time kind of working with the full stack, the M, the V, and the C, just so we can kind of get an idea of how all those parts go together. That good? Can I answer any questions for anyone? All right.
Well, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Would you suggest TextMate over Vim?
Oh, no, I wouldn't. I would suggest whatever you're comfortable or happy with. Yeah. I like TextMate. I can get by in Vim. It's just that I guess I haven't invested enough time in Vim to get really efficient at it. Work for me in Vim tends to be slower than it is in TextMate. So for now, I still stick with TextMate. But if you're good with Vim, if you're happy with Vim, then yeah, by all means, use it. I wish I was better at Vim.
Yeah, I'm not very good. I'm trying to get.
Okay.
It seems
Yeah.
like it'd be really quick if you get good at it.
I've got it. I always keep it configured, and it seems like I pull it out of the closet every couple weeks thinking, that's it. This is the point where I start working in Vim and nothing else. And then an hour later, I'm back in TextMate. It's like an abusive relationship, you know. I need to get rid of TextMate someday. Any other questions? Well, you all have a great weekend then, and I will see you next Tuesday. You know there's no classes Monday, right? I forgot. Somebody reminded me yesterday.
Monday.
Martin Luther King holiday. Okay. Have a good one. Let's see if this video worked. Whoa.